The operating theater was a world of cold light and hushed focus, a sterile sanctuary where life and death were measured in millimeters and heartbeats. At its center, under the intense glare of the surgical lamps, Dr. Eris Thorne worked with a stillness that seemed to defy the chaos she was commanding. Her hands, gloved and steady, moved with an economy of motion that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. They were not just the hands of a surgeon. They were the hands of an artist at the pinnacle of her craft, weaving life back into a failing heart. The patient on the table, a man whose name and life story were now reduced to the frantic lines on the monitors, was suffering from a catastrophic aortic dissection, a tear in the body's largest artery, a ticking clock that had almost run out. The standard procedure was a brutal, high-risk affair with a grim prognosis. But Eris was not performing the standard procedure. She was doing something new. Something she had perfected, a technique that involved micro-sutures and a sequence of maneuvers so complex that few surgeons in the country even dared to study it, let alone attempt it. Micro-forceps. She said, her voice calm and low, barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the rhythmic beeping of the machines with absolute authority. A nurse, her eyes never leaving Eris's hands, slapped the instrument into her palm with practiced perfection. The entire team, 2 nurses, an anesthesiologist, and a perfusionist running the heart-lung machine, moved around her like planets orbiting a sun. They were her team loyalists who had chosen to follow a brilliant but demanding star rather than remain in the comfortable, predictable orbits of the hospital's established figures. They had seen her perform miracles and had long since learned to trust her quiet confidence over the loud proclamations of others. The air was thick with unspoken tension. The patient's blood pressure, artificially maintained by the bypass machine, was a fragile thread. Eris was working deep within the chest cavity, her field of vision, a small crimson-lit stage. She placed a stitch, then another, each one impossibly small, pulling the delicate tissue together. It was like repairing a tear in wet silk, with a thread spun from a spider's web. Pressure, holding steady at 90/60, Dr. Evans, the anesthesiologist, reported from behind his wall of screens. His voice was a steady bass line to the soprano melody of the monitors. He had been with Eris for 5 years, a man who had seen every kind of surgeon imaginable, and had chosen to anchor his career to her rising, often turbulent star. He trusted her hands more than he trusted most medical textbooks. "Thank you, Mark," she murmured, not looking up. Her concentration was a physical force, a bubble of pure focus that enveloped the operating table. In this space, there were no hospital politics, no skeptical colleagues, no whispers about her background. There was only the problem and the solution she held in her hands. Above them, in the darkened observation gallery, Dr. Julian Croft watched with his arms crossed, a knot of something bitter and tight in his chest. He was by every traditional metric the hospital's golden boy. The son of a famed surgeon educated at the finest institutions, with a pedigree as polished as his expensive Italian shoes. He was handsome, charismatic, and a technically brilliant surgeon who followed the established masters with unwavering fidelity. He saw surgery as a noble tradition, a craft to be honored, not a canvas for reckless experimentation. And to him, Eris Thorne was the embodiment of recklessness. He watched her now, his eyes narrowed. He couldn't deny her dexterity. Her hands were impossibly steady, her movements fluid. But he saw it not as genius, but as showmanship. Her techniques were too flashy, too unconventional. They were the kind of high-wire acts that looked impressive when they succeeded, but were unforgivably arrogant. He'd read her papers, seen the data, but he couldn't shake the deep-seated belief that it was a fluke. She was a statistical anomaly, a product of a system so desperate for diversity that it was willing to elevate someone who didn't fit the mold, someone who hadn't paid her dues in the same currency he and his forefathers had. "Look at her," he muttered to a younger resident standing beside him, a sycophant named Miller who shadowed Croft's every move. "It's a performance. Surgery is about discipline, about proven methods. It's not a theatrical production." Miller nodded eagerly, his eyes wide. "Her success rates are remarkable, though, sir. Remarkable risks yield remarkable results for a time," Croft countered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Until they yield a remarkable catastrophe. The foundation of medicine is, do no harm." Her methods flirt with that line constantly. But even as he spoke the words, a part of him, the surgeon's part, the part that respected pure skill, knew he was lying to himself. He was watching a masterclass. He could see the elegance of her solution, the way she navigated around structures he would have simply cut through. It was a different language of surgery, one he refused to learn because it would mean admitting his own fluency was incomplete. It was infuriating. She had risen too fast, earned the loyalty of her team too easily, and commanded an authority that he felt should have been his. Down below, Eris was beginning the final, most delicate phase, regrafting the coronary arteries onto the new aortic root. Her movements slowed, becoming even more deliberate. The heart, silent and still on the bypass machine, was a vulnerable alien thing. Soon she would have to ask it to beat again. She would have to trust that her work was perfect. Beginning reperfusion sequence, she announced. The perfusionist acknowledged, starting the process of allowing warm, oxygenated blood to flow back into the dormant heart muscle. The room held its collective breath. This was the moment of truth. The heart, now flushed with returning blood, quivered. It was a chaotic, disorganized shudder. Fibrillation. On the monitor, the clean, rhythmic beep was replaced by a frantic, jagged line. "Paddles," Eris said, her voice unchanged. The nurse handed her the internal defibrillator paddles. Eris placed them directly on the heart. Charging. Clear. The team stepped back. A small jolt of electricity surged through the muscle. The heart convulsed, and then nothing. Still fibrillating. Croft let out a barely audible scoff in the gallery. This is it, he thought. The show is over. Again, charge to 30. Again the jolt. The heart jumped. On the monitor, the jagged line wavered, then flattened for a terrifying second. In that silence, a single resonant beat echoed through the theater's speakers. It was followed by another and another, each one stronger, more certain than the last. A slow, steady, powerful rhythm began to assert itself. Sinus rhythm. A perfect beat. A wave of palpable relief washed through the room. Someone let out a shaky breath. Dr. Evans looked up from his monitors and gave Eris a slow, appreciative nod. "Welcome back," he said softly, speaking to the patient. Eris watched the monitor for another 10 seconds, her expression unreadable behind her surgical mask. Only when she was completely satisfied did she step back. "Close him up," she said to her assisting surgeon. Her part was done. She stripped off her gloves and gown, her movements economical and precise, and walked out of the theater without a backward glance, leaving her team to finish the final steps. Croft watched her go, the bitter taste in his mouth now mixed with a grudging, infuriating awe. He turned away from the window, his jaw tight. A gambler's luck, he said to Miller, more to convince himself than the resident. "Let's go. We have rounds." An hour later, Eris sat in her small Spartan office, a space that served more as a storage closet for medical journals than a place of rest. The adrenaline from the surgery was beginning to fade, leaving behind a familiar bone-deep weariness. She was finishing her notes on the procedure when her desk phone rang. It was the chief of surgery, Dr. Albright. "Eris," he began, his voice weary. Albright was a man nearing retirement, a politician in a surgeon's coat who managed the department by avoiding conflict at all costs. This usually meant siding with the established powers, namely Croft and his faction. "I heard about the dissection. Another unconventional success, I'm told." "The patient is stable in the ICU," Robert Eris replied, keeping her tone neutral. She knew this stance well. "Yes. Well, Julian expressed some concerns about the risks involved. We have protocols for a reason, Eris. You can't keep running the hospital's most critical patients through a clinical trial. It's not a trial if it works," every time she said the words sharper than she intended. "My data speaks for itself." There was a long sigh on the other end of the line. "Just try to keep a lower profile. The board gets nervous about new techniques. They like predictability." He meant Croft gets nervous about you. "Good work today," he added, a hollow platitude before he hung up. Eris leaned back in her chair, the exhaustion now mingled with a familiar sense of isolation. She had just saved a man's life with a procedure that would be written about in textbooks one day, and her reward was a warning to be less brilliant. This was her daily reality at Sterling Memorial Hospital. She was respected for her results, but resented for her methods, an outsider who had crashed the gates of an exclusive club and refused to play by their rules. She was alone, a singular talent, in a system that valued conformity above all else. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence of her office settle around her. The quiet was a welcome reprieve, a chance to recharge before heading home. That peace was shattered a moment later. It started with a single high-pitched beep from the pager on her belt. Before she could even look at it, it was joined by another, and then her cell phone began to vibrate violently on the desk, its screen lighting up with a hospital-wide emergency alert. Through her closed door, she heard a rising chorus of pagers going off down the hallway, a frantic digital symphony of chaos. Then came the overhead announcement, the calm, automated female voice replaced by the panicked, breathless voice of a live operator. Code triage. All levels. Code triage. Mass casualty incident reported. Southside Bridge collapse. Repeat, Southside Bridge has collapsed. All available surgical and emergency personnel report to the ER immediately. Aris was on her feet before the announcement finished, her weariness vanishing, replaced by a cold, sharp surge of adrenaline. She could already hear the distant rising wail of sirens, dozens of them converging on the hospital. The floor beneath her feet seemed to hum with the sudden frantic energy of hundreds of people running, shouting, preparing for the unthinkable. The calm was gone. The storm had arrived. And as she sprinted towards the emergency room, she knew that the meticulously ordered world of the operating theater was about to be replaced by a battleground, and the petty rivalries of the hospital would be the last thing that mattered. Or perhaps the only thing. The journey from her office to the emergency room was like descending through the circles of a modern-day inferno. The upper floors of the hospital were humming with a tense, controlled energy, but as Aris moved lower, the order began to fray. Hallways that were usually quiet corridors of healing were now clogged with rolling beds and scurrying staff. The air grew thick with the sounds of shouted commands, frantic questions, and the metallic clang of equipment. By the time the elevator doors opened onto the ground floor, she was met with a wall of sound and a current of human desperation so powerful it was almost a physical force. The ER at Sterling Memorial had been designed to handle the city's worst days, but it had not been designed for this. It was a war zone. Gurneys lined every available inch of hallway space, their occupants a devastating tableau of injury-dust-covered construction workers with vacant eyes. A woman in a business suit with a grotesque shard of metal protruding from her shoulder. A young man crying silently as a nurse tried to staunch the bleeding from his leg. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood, the sharp sting of antiseptic, and the acrid scent of burnt metal that clung to the victim's clothing. Nurses and residents moved through the chaos with a desperate, focused intensity, their faces grim masks of professionalism. Every few seconds, the automatic doors would slide open with a pneumatic hiss, admitting another wave of paramedics and another gurney, another life hanging in the balance. It was a system pushed beyond its breaking point, a dam about to burst. Aris moved through the flood, her mind automatically triaging her eyes, scanning, processing, categorizing. While others saw chaos, she saw patterns. She saw the subtle signs of internal bleeding in a patient everyone else had marked as stable. She saw the almost imperceptible tracheal deviation in a man struggling to breathe that signaled attention pneumothorax. Her mind was a finely tuned instrument cutting through the noise to find the signal. And then she saw him. Dr. Julian Croft stood at the epicenter of the ER, the self-appointed general in this sudden war. To his credit, he was thriving. In a crisis, Croft's arrogance transformed into a potent form of command. He was decisive, loud, and utterly certain in his own authority. He stood before the main triage board, a tablet in one hand, pointing and directing the flow of bodies with the confidence of a conductor leading a chaotic orchestra. Bay 3 is full. Take the femoral bleed to Trauma 1. Now I need 2 units of ONEG and a chest tube kit in there yesterday. His voice boomed over the din. Miller. Stop standing there and get me a head CT on the patient from Gurney 12. I don't care if the line is long, tell them it's on my authority. The staff, desperate for direction, responded to his certainty. He was a lighthouse in the storm, and they were all too willing to steer by his light. He was creating order, but it was a blunt, brute force order. He was processing patients like an assembly line, prioritizing the most visible, obvious injuries, the gushers, the breaks, the open wounds. It was effective, but it was not nuanced. It was the work of a carpenter, not a watchmaker. Aris knew his methods would save many lives. She also knew they would miss the subtle, complex cases that would die quietly in a hallway while waiting for a scan he deemed less important. She saw Ben, her young resident, struggling to intubate a patient with facial trauma, his hands shaking slightly. She moved to his side instinctively. "Easy, Ben," she said, her voice a quiet island of calm in his sea of panic. You're forcing it. Tilt the head back more. Use the smaller blade. Look for the glottis, don't just push. Ben looked up, his eyes wide with relief at the sight of her. He followed her instructions, and a moment later the tube slid into place. The patient's oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor immediately began to climb from a dangerous low. "Thank you, doctor." He breathed, his shoulders slumping. "You did the work," she said, giving his shoulder a firm squeeze before moving on. "Now do it again on the next one." She continued her silent survey, her presence a low hum of competence beneath Croft's roaring engine of command. She helped a nurse insert an IV into a patient with collapsing veins, diagnosed a likely splenic rupture in a woman complaining only of shoulder pain, and instructed a junior doctor to order a specific blood test that would reveal a life-threatening condition. She wasn't giving orders. She was planting seeds of life-saving information, quietly correcting the course of the massive, chaotic ship that Croft was steering. Then she saw the gurney that made her heart stop. The paramedics were rushing in a young girl no older than 16. She was conscious, but her breathing was shallow, her face pale and beaded with sweat. She was clutching her chest, and a dark, ugly bruise was spreading across her sternum like a storm cloud. It was the classic sign of a steering wheel injury. Multiple contusions, possible fractured ribs. BP is 80/40 and falling. The paramedic rattled off. She was the driver of a car that was crushed on the bridge. Croft turned his eyes, scanning the girl with a practiced glance. Blunt force chest trauma. Get her to trauma 2. Start a large bore IV, get a chest x-ray, and call for a general surgery consult. He made the call in 2 seconds, a standard by-the-book response. He was about to turn away, his mind already on the next patient, the next fire to put out. But Eris saw more. She saw the faint distension of the veins in the girl's neck. She saw the muffled quality of her heart, sounds a subtle detail only an expert would notice in this noisy environment. It wasn't just fractured ribs. It was cardiac tamponade. Blood was filling the sac around the girl's heart, squeezing it, preventing it from beating properly. A chest x-ray would take too long. A general surgeon might not diagnose it until it was too late. The girl didn't have 30 minutes. She likely had less than 10. This was a problem that required a cardiac surgeon immediately. This was a problem that required her. She strode forward her path, intersecting Croft's just as he turned to shout another order. "Julian!" She said, her voice cutting through the noise, forcing him to look at her. He froze, his expression shifting from one of command to one of annoyance. He saw her not as a colleague offering help, but as a rival encroaching on his territory, questioning his authority in front of his troops. "What is it, Thorne?" he said, his tone dismissive. "I'm a little busy running the ER in case you hadn't noticed." "That girl," Eris said, ignoring his tone and pointing to the gurney being wheeled away. "The blunt force chest trauma. It's not just contusions. She has Beck's triad. Muffled heart sounds, hypotension, jugular, venous distension. It's tamponade." Croft's eyes flickered with a moment of uncertainty before his pride slammed the door shut. Admitting she was right would be admitting he had missed something. In his mind, in this moment of crisis, such an admission was a sign of weakness he could not afford. "I've already assigned her to general surgery," he said, his voice hard and loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They can handle a few broken ribs. We have more critical patients to deal with." "She won't survive the wait for a consult," Eris insisted, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a low, urgent pitch. "She needs a pericardiocentesis now, or a thoracotomy. I can do it right here." The challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. By offering her expertise, she was implicitly stating that his was insufficient. To everyone watching, the nurses, the residents, the other doctors, it was a direct challenge to his command. Croft's face hardened, his expression turning to stone. He took a deliberate step toward her, using his height to loom over her slightly. The moment stretched the background chaos of the ER, seeming to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a spotlight of confrontation. He looked past her at the sea of panicked faces and injured bodies, then back at her, his eyes cold. He was going to make an example of her. He was going to reassert his dominance unequivocally. "Thorne," he began, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone was more chilling than any yell. "The ER is my domain. We are following my protocols. We don't need hotshot specialists with their pet theories getting in the way." He paused, letting the insult land. He saw the flicker of disbelief and anger in her eyes. He pressed his advantage. "Coordinate with the nurses," he said, his voice dripping with condescending finality. He gestured vaguely toward the chaotic hallways. Help them with IVs, run labs, make yourself useful. But stay outside the trauma bay. The words were a slap in the face. Outside the trauma bay. It was the surgical equivalent of being told to sit at the children's table. He had not just rejected her diagnosis, he had dismissed her entire specialty. He had, in front of dozens of their colleagues, declared her irrelevant. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the staff closest to them. Ben, her resident, looked horrified. An older nurse who had worked with Eris for years stared at Croft with open hostility. Eris stood frozen for a single long second, the public humiliation washing over her. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to argue, to list her credentials, and force him to listen. But she saw the look in his eyes, a cold, triumphant certainty. He wanted a fight. A public argument would only cement his control and make her look emotional and unstable. It would do nothing to help the girl who was now disappearing behind the doors of Trauma 2. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her professional life. She said nothing. She held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression an unreadable mask of calm, a silent promise that this was not over. Then she turned her back on him. She did not retreat. She made a calculated, tactical withdrawal. As she walked away from the heart of the ER, away from the trauma bays he had forbidden her to enter, she could feel his victorious smirk on her back. He thought he had won. He thought he had put the upstart in her place. He had no idea that in trying to sideline her, he had just unleashed her. He had taken away her tools, so now she would have to build new ones. And the first order of business would be to save the girl he had just condemned to death. Humiliation was a fire that could either consume or forge. As Eris Thorne walked away from Julian Croft, she felt its heat lick at her pride, but she did not let it burn her. Instead, she channeled it, letting the intense energy sharpen her focus until it was a fine, razor-thin edge. She was a surgeon. She knew how to compartmentalize, how to cut away the useless emotion and address the underlying pathology. The pathology in this case was not just a failing heart, but a failing system currently personified by the man who had just cast her out. She found a position at a nursing station that had been temporarily abandoned, a small island of relative calm at the edge of the ER's swirling vortex. From here, she had a panoramic view of the battlefield. It was as she had assessed organized chaos, but now with a surgeon's diagnostic eye, she began to see the fatal flaws in Croft's strategy. He was a general fighting the last war using textbook tactics against an enemy that required innovation and adaptability. His system was built on speed of disposition, not accuracy of diagnosis. He was pushing patients through the pipeline, sending them off for scans and consults, clearing beds to make room for the next wave. On the surface, it looked like decisive action. The big board was full of checkmarks and orders, but Eris saw the dangerous bottleneck he was creating. The hospital had 2 CT scanners and 4 X-ray machines. By ordering scans on nearly every patient with a visible injury, Croft had created a traffic jam of the worried well and the moderately injured. A man with a simple broken arm was in the same queue as a patient who might be bleeding into their brain. His refusal to perform more detailed bedside assessments meant he was outsourcing his diagnosis to the radiology department, a process that cost the most valuable commodity they had: time. Her gaze kept drifting to the closed doors of Trauma 2. The girl. The ticking clock of her heart was a sound only Eris could hear, and it was growing louder with every passing minute. A young surgical resident, looking pale and barely out of medical school, hurried out of the room and over to the central desk. Eris could read the uncertainty in his posture, the slight panic in his eyes. He was looking for the results of the chest X-ray that Croft had ordered. Eris knew what that X-ray would show: a slightly enlarged cardiac silhouette. Maybe some fluid, but nothing definitive enough for a junior resident to act upon. It was a cowardly test in this situation, a way to delay a difficult decision. The girl's diagnosis couldn't be made with a static image. It had to be made with a stethoscope, a pressure cuff, and a trained eye. It had to be made by a specialist who knew what to look for, and that specialist was currently blacklisted from entering the room. While the resident waited, the girl inside was dying. The pericardial sac was inelastic. As blood filled the space, it constricted the heart, preventing the ventricles from expanding fully. With each beat, her heart could pump less and less blood. Her blood pressure would continue to drop. Her organs would be starved of oxygen, and soon she would go into cardiac arrest. It was a quiet, insidious death, one that happened inside the chest, while on the outside everything looked deceptively stable until the very end. Frustration coiled in Eris's gut, a cold, hard knot. She tore her eyes away from Trauma 2 and forced herself to scan the rest of the room to see the other mistakes to build a case. It didn't take long. She saw an elderly man on a gurney parked in a hallway, a tag on his wrist marking him as low priority. He was pale, his skin clammy. He clutched his abdomen, his breathing shallow. He had no obvious wounds, no dramatic bleeding. To Croft's sweeping triage, he was just an old man with a stomachache, a distraction from the more cinematic injuries. Eris saw the subtle bruising beginning to blossom around his navel Cullen's sign. It was a telltale indicator of retroperitoneal bleeding, a slow, massive hemorrhage deep inside his body. He was bleeding out internally, his life draining away into his own abdominal cavity, and he had been labeled a non-emergency. Not far from him was a woman in her 40s, sitting upright and speaking lucidly to a nurse, complaining of a severe headache. She had a small cut on her forehead, which had been quickly stitched. She had been cleared for a CT scan, but because of the backlog, she was simply waiting. Eris noticed the woman pause mid-sentence, her eyes losing focus for a bare second. She saw one of her pupils ever so slightly larger than the other. Anisocoria. It was a sign of mounting intracranial pressure. The lucid interval. Soon, the pressure in her skull would become too great, and she would suffer a catastrophic herniation. She was a neurological time bomb, and she was sitting in a queue behind a dozen patients with sprained ankles and fractured wrists. It was medical malpractice on a mass scale, all performed under the guise of decisive leadership. Croft wasn't saving the day. He was curating a disaster, prioritizing the bleeding limbs he could see over the dying organs he couldn't. A movement at her elbow startled her. It was Ben, his face a mixture of fear and conflict. He was clutching a suture kit, his knuckles white. "Dr. Thorne," he whispered, his eyes darting around to make sure no one, especially Croft, was watching them. "He's assigned me to stitch up lacerations in the minor injuries wing." It was a deliberate insult. Ben was one of the most promising surgical residents, a man Eris was personally mentoring for a career in cardiothoracic surgery. Assigning him to simple stitch work was like using a scalpel to spread butter. Croft was not only sidelining her, he was dismantling her team, scattering her allies. "Then you will perform that duty to the best of your ability." Eris set her voice even. She would not put Ben in the position of open insubordination. His career was still a fragile thing. But the girl Ben pressed, his voice cracking with anxiety. "In Trauma 2. I heard what you said. I believe you. The general surgery resident in there. He's in over his head. He just keeps ordering more tests." "What does your training tell you?" Ben Eris asked, her eyes holding his. He swallowed hard. "My training tells me that in the presence of Beck's triad following blunt chest trauma, you don't wait for an x-ray, you get a bedside ultrasound, or you put a needle in the chest. My training tells me she's dying." "And what does your fear tell you?" she asked softly. Ben's gaze fell to the floor. "It tells me that Dr. Croft can have me dismissed from this residency program with a single phone call. It tells me that my career will be over before it starts if I cross him." He looked back up at her, his expression pleading. "What do I do?" Eris felt a surge of protectiveness for the young man. He was a good doctor with a good heart. He deserved better than this impossible choice. She placed a hand on his arm. "For now, you do as you are told." She said, her voice firm but kind. "You are no use to anyone if you are thrown out of this hospital, but you keep your eyes open. You document everything you see. Be a doctor, Ben, a witness." He nodded, the conflict still raging in his eyes, but he seemed to take strength from her steady presence. He gave her a final worried look before turning to head toward the minor injuries wing, a soldier ordered away from the main front. Eris was alone again, but Ben's plea had solidified her resolve. Croft had created a kingdom of one, a dictatorship built on fear and the illusion of control. Direct confrontation was impossible. Arguing with him was like reasoning with a hurricane. She could not go through him. She would have to go around him. She was a surgeon. Her entire life was about finding pathways, creating bypasses when the main artery was blocked. That's what she would do now. Her mind began to work with a new, cold clarity. She needed leverage. She needed allies. She needed an authority greater than Croft's. Dr. Albright, the chief of surgery, was useless. He would fold under the slightest pressure from Croft. The hospital administrator was a bureaucrat who wouldn't intervene without irrefutable proof of malpractice, which would only be available after the autopsies were complete. No, she needed someone who understood the chain of command, but also trusted her skill implicitly. Someone who could look at the situation and understand the medical nuances without needing a slideshow. Her eyes scanned the chaotic room one last time. The girl in trauma 2. The man bleeding into his belly. The woman with the pressure building in her brain. They were not just patients anymore. They were evidence. They were the exhibits in the case she was about to build. She turned away from the nursing station, her movements now filled with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb scrolling through her contacts. She was no longer just an observer. She was a prosecutor, and she was about to find her judge. The ticking clock was no longer just a sound of impending death. It was the deadline for her to find a way to act. And she was running out of time. Eris's mind sifted through the hospital's hierarchy, discarding one option after another. The formal chain of command was a sclerotic artery, clogged with bureaucracy and political cholesterol. To appeal to them would be a slow death sentence for the patients who needed help now. Croft had blocked the main vessel of authority, so she would perform a bypass. She would find a collateral pathway, one that was faster, more efficient, and closer to the heart of the matter. That pathway had a name: Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was the charge nurse of the ER, a title that utterly failed to capture her true role. She was the department's institutional memory, its conscience, and its unshakable core. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen every imaginable form of human suffering and triumph. Doctors, even chiefs of staff, came and went. Sarah endured. Her authority was not granted by a title, but forged in 30 years of trial by fire. She ran the ER, and anyone with an ounce of sense knew it. More importantly, she was intimidated by no one, least of all an arrogant surgeon on a power trip. She respected skill, not status. Aris found her near the ambulance bay, directing the flow of incoming gurneys, with the calm, efficient gestures of an air traffic controller. She was not shouting. Her voice was a low, firm instrument that cut through the noise and commanded immediate obedience. Aris approached her not as a superior, but as a colleague seeking a consult. She waited until Sarah had finished directing a team before speaking. "Sarah," she said quietly. Sarah turned her eyes, taking in Aris's tense posture in a single sweeping glance. She had seen the confrontation with Croft. Little happened in her ER that she didn't see. "Dr. Thorne." She replied, her tone neutral, but her eyes asking the real question. "What do you need?" "I need your eyes," Aris said, keeping her voice low and factual. She would not appeal to emotion. She would appeal to the one thing Sarah valued above all else: clinical evidence. "What's the current wait time for a portable chest X-ray to be read by radiology?" Sarah's lips thinned. "An hour, maybe more. Croft has them chasing shadows on a dozen minor fractures." "It's a mess." She didn't need to elaborate. She knew a bottleneck when she saw one. "What was the last blood pressure reading on the Jane Doe in trauma 2? Aris asked, her voice precise. Sarah's eyes sharpened. She knew exactly which patient Aris meant. 70 over 45 minutes ago. The resident in there is trying to get a central line in. He's fumbling. Aris nodded, storing the information. 70 over 40. The girl was crashing. The resident was wasting precious time on a procedure that wouldn't solve the underlying problem. "One more thing," Aris said. "Have you seen the elderly gentleman in hallway C, the one with the abdominal pain?" "John Doe, number 7. Sarah said, her memory a flawless database, tagged as level 3 priority, waiting for a CT. "Check his navel, Sarah. Tell me what you see. And look at his skin. He's pale for a man who isn't actively bleeding." She didn't need to say more. She had laid out the pieces of the puzzle, the clinical signs, the damning data. She trusted Sarah to put them together. It was a profound show of respect, acknowledging that the charge nurse's diagnostic skills were as sharp as any doctor's. Sarah held Aris's gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between the two women. In that moment, an alliance was forged. Sarah had seen Croft's brand of arrogant command before. She had seen doctors like him kill patients with their pride. And she had seen the quiet, unnerving competence of Dr. Thorne up close in the operating room. She knew whose judgment to trust. "The portable ultrasound machine is being hogged by orthopedics for a shoulder dislocation," Sarah said, her voice deceptively casual as she turned away and began wiping down a counter. Funny, I could have sworn its primary function was for fast exams in the trauma bay. Eris understood immediately. A focused assessment with sonography for trauma. A fast exam was exactly what the girl needed. It would show the fluid around her heart in seconds. They can be very territorial about equipment, Eris replied, playing her part. Things get misplaced in a crisis. Sarah said, her eyes glinting as she looked up. I'll see if I can't locate it. With that, Sarah moved away, melting back into the chaos. But her movements now had a new purpose. Eris watched as the whispers of dissent began. It was a subtle, masterful campaign, invisible to a man like Croft, who only recognized shouted orders. Sarah didn't openly defy him. She simply reinterpreted his commands through the lens of common sense and 30 years of experience. She approached an experienced ER doctor, a man named Dr. Ramirez, who was examining a patient with a minor head wound. David, Sarah said, her voice a murmur. I need a second opinion on the John Doe in hallway C. The one with the belly pain. My gut is telling me something's wrong there. By framing it as her own concern, she gave Ramirez the professional cover he needed. He trusted Sarah's gut more than any textbook. He nodded and discreetly made his way toward the elderly man Eris had identified. Next, Sarah spoke to a senior nurse. Linda, the general surgery resident in Trauma 2, seems overwhelmed. Why don't you go in there and assist him? Make sure the patient's vitals are being cycled every 2 minutes, not every 5. An order couched as a suggestion, it put another pair of experienced eyes on the dying girl. A few minutes later, as if by magic, the portable ultrasound machine appeared from a supply closet and was parked just outside the doors of Trauma 2. No one had ordered it. It was just there, ready. Eris watched it all unfold, a quiet general watching her brilliant field commander execute a flanking maneuver. While Croft was busy fighting fires at the front, Sarah was rerouting the water supply, undermining his authority one quiet conversation at a time. The true power in the ER was reasserting itself not through volume, but through competence. Meanwhile, in the minor injuries wing, Ben was suturing a deep gash on a man's arm. His hands were steady, the stitches neat and precise, but his mind was elsewhere. He could hear the constant, frantic overhead pages, the distant alarms, the shouts. He felt like a soldier polishing his boots while the battle raged miles away. Dr. Thorne's words echoed in his head. Be a witness. He felt like a coward. Every stitch he placed felt like a betrayal of the oath he had taken. His thoughts were shattered by a new sound, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a series of sharp, frantic alarms cutting through the general din with a piercing urgency. It was the unmistakable sound of a cardiac monitor in full crisis. The sound was coming from the direction of the main trauma bays. He looked up, his eyes meeting those of a nurse across the wing. She too had heard it. What was that, she asked? Then a voice, young and panicked, came crackling over the intercom system. It was the general surgery resident. Code Blue Trauma 2. I need a crash cart in trauma. 2 patient is in PA arrest. Pulseless electrical activity. The heart still had an electrical rhythm, but it was no longer pumping blood. It was the final desperate stage before flatlining. Eris heard it and was already moving. She saw Linda, the nurse Sarah had sent in, burst out of the room, her face ashen. She's arrested. He can't get the needle in, she yelled to Sarah. Croft, who had been intubating a patient in Trauma 1, heard the commotion. His head snapped up his face, a mask of fury and surprise. A code. In a patient he had deemed stable enough for a consult. It was a direct repudiation of his judgment. He ripped off his gloves and stormed out of the room, heading toward the crisis. But Ben was closer, the moment he heard Trauma 2. Every ounce of fear and indecision in his body evaporated, burned away by a pure clinical certainty. Dr. Thorne was right. He had stood by and done nothing, and now the girl was dying. Not on his watch. He dropped the needle driver on his sterile tray. Finish this, he snapped at a junior nurse, his voice filled with a command she had never heard from him before. He didn't wait for a reply. He broke into a run, pushing past gurneys and startled staff. He was no longer a resident afraid for his career. He was a doctor running toward a dying patient. He was running toward the room his superior had effectively forbidden him to enter. He was running toward the girl he knew he could help save, and in doing so he was running headlong into a collision with Dr. Julian Croft. The whispers of dissent were about to become a full-throated roar. The universe of the ER collapsed into a single-point Trauma 2. 3 figures propelled by 3 different motives converged on its doors. Ben driven by a desperate resurgent conscience. Dr. Julian Croft fueled by incandescent rage at the challenge to his authority. And Dr. Eris Thorne propelled by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Ben burst through the doors first and was met by a scene of controlled pandemonium. The girl was on the gurney, her skin a terrifying shade of bluish gray. A nurse was performing chest compressions, a grim rhythmic pumping that was doing little more than agitating the blood-filled sac around the heart. The young surgical resident, sweat beading on his forehead, was fumbling with a pericardiocentesis needle, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't find the correct insertion point beneath the sternum. The monitor screamed a continuous flatline tone, the electronic declaration of death. "I can't find the angle." The resident stammered, his voice cracking. "There's no pulse." "Of course there's no pulse, you're not pumping any blood," a nurse yelled back, her face flushed with exertion. Eris entered a half-second behind Ben, her eyes absorbing the entire catastrophic scene in an instant. The fumbling resident, the ineffective CPR, the flatline. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the fluid, unstoppable force of a wave, shoving the panicked resident aside with a firm hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a violent act, but it was one of absolute, irrefutable command. "Stop compression," she ordered. The nurse, startled, immediately obeyed. Ultrasound. Sarah Jenkins, who had followed them, was already there, pushing the machine Eris knew she would need. She slapped a probe into Eris's waiting hand. Eris squeezed a dollop of gel onto the girl's chest and pressed the probe to the skin. On the screen, a grainy black and white image appeared. It was exactly as she had predicted, but worse. The heart, a flickering, struggling shape, was almost completely crushed by a massive black halo of fluid, the pericardial effusion. It was a heart being strangled in its own chamber. There, Eris said, her voice a blade of ice. "Massive tamponade. CPR is useless. We need to drain it or open her chest." It was at that precise moment that Julian Croft stormed into the room, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Thorne, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice shaking the small room. "I gave you a direct order, get out of my trauma bay." He took a step toward her, his intention clear. He was going to physically remove her. But before he could cross the space between them, two things happened simultaneously that altered the entire power dynamic of the hospital. First, Sarah Jenkins, the charge nurse, stepped directly into Croft's path. She was a foot shorter than him, but she stood like a mountain. "She's trying to save the patient you misdiagnosed, Julian," she said, her voice dangerously quiet and devoid of any honorific. It was the most profound act of insubordination the ER had seen in years. Second, a man in a tailored suit, his face pale and bewildered, appeared in the doorway, drawn by the code blue alarm and the shouting. It was Mr. Harrison, the hospital administrator. He was a man of balance sheets and liability reports, a bureaucrat who understood very little about medicine, but everything about the catastrophic cost of failure. He saw a room in chaos, a dying patient, his star surgeon in a shouting match with another, and his most senior nurse on the verge of open mutiny. "What is going on here?" Harrison demanded, his voice tight with panic. Croft's head snapped toward him, momentarily distracted. He saw his chance to crush Eris with the weight of authority. "Mr. Harrison, Dr. Thorne has disobeyed a direct order and interfered with a patient's care. She is jeopardizing this entire ER." But Sarah was faster. She turned to the administrator, her expression one of grave professional concern. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. "Dr. Croft's protocols are failing. I have personally witnessed Dr. Thorne identify 3 critical patients, including this one, who were being neglected. This girl will be dead in less than 60 seconds if Dr. Thorne is not allowed to intervene. That is my official assessment." The statement was a tactical nuke. The most respected, longest-serving nurse in the department had just formally, in front of the highest authority present, declared the commander of the ER incompetent. She had created an official record of the event, a fact that would be front and center in the inevitable malpractice lawsuit. She had given Harrison and Eris the leverage they needed. Harrison's face went white. He looked from Sarah's resolute expression to Croft's sputtering rage, and then to Eris, who had ignored the entire exchange. Her attention was locked on the ultrasound screen and the dying heart it displayed. She had her opening. Now it was time for the gambit. She still hadn't looked at Croft or Harrison. Her focus was absolute. To a nurse she commanded, "Get me a thoracotomy tray and a sterile field. Now." Then to Ben, who was standing by her side, his fear replaced by a fierce, focused readiness. She said, "Ben, you're going to assist. Get gowned." Ben didn't even glance at Croft. He moved immediately, his loyalty declared not with words, but with action. Only then did Aris look up. Her eyes, cold and brilliant, bypassed Croft entirely and locked onto the terrified administrator. She held a scalpel in her hand, its sterile blade catching the harsh overhead light. "I am taking operating room 3, she announced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room, silencing every other sound. It was not a request. It was the statement of an irrefutable fact. She turned her head slightly enough to address Sarah. "Get it prepped. I want it ready for me in 5 minutes. And I want the John Doe from Hallway C and the woman with the head injury sent for immediate surgical consults with their respective specialists. Inform them it is on my authority." She had just decapitated Croft's chain of command and instituted her own. Finally, she turned her head and for the first time looked directly at the apoplectic Dr. Croft. Her expression was devoid of triumph or anger. It was the calm, detached gaze of a surgeon who had identified a cancer and was preparing to excise it. "The 5 most critical patients in this ER are currently dying due to an inefficient triage system," she stated, her words a clinical diagnosis of his leadership. "I am going to save them, starting with this girl. My team is prepping an OR now." She paused, letting the weight of her declaration settle into the stunned silence of the room. She then delivered the final, inescapable checkmate. "Dr. Croft," she said, her voice as sharp and clean as the scalpel she held. "You have 2 choices. You can scrub in and assist me, or you can remain here and prepare your statement for the hospital's board of directors and for that girl's family, explaining exactly why you let her die." The ultimatum was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. She had offered him a chance to save face, to be part of the solution, while simultaneously making it clear that any opposition would be an admission of guilt. She had laid the life of this patient and the legal fate of the hospital squarely at his feet. She had leveraged his pride and Harrison's fear against each other, creating a space where her competence was the only possible answer. The room was utterly silent, save for the dying drone of the heart monitor. Ben stood ready. Sarah was already on her phone barking orders to the OR staff. The nurses in the room looked at Aris with a newfound awe. Mr. Harrison stared, his mouth slightly agape, looking between the furious trapped surgeon and the woman who had just seized control of his hospital, with nothing more than a scalpel and an unbreakable will. Croft's face was a mottled canvas of purple and red, his fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He had been so thoroughly, so completely outmaneuvered, that he was left speechless. Aris didn't wait for his answer. She turned back to her patient. "Scalpel," she said to the nurse beside her, who slapped it into her hand. Her gambit was on the table. The coup was complete. Now she just had to save the lives she had wagered everything on. Operating Room 3 became the eye of the hurricane. Outside its doors, the chaos of the ER still raged, a storm of injury and fear. But inside, a profound and absolute calm descended. It was the calm of pure, undiluted competence. The air chilled and sterile hummed with the quiet efficiency of machinery and the focused breathing of a team that had found its true commander. At the center of this quiet universe stood Aris Thorne, no longer a renegade, but a sovereign in her rightful domain. Her first action had been a calculated defiance of every standard hospital protocol. The girl was too unstable to move. To risk transporting her to the OR even a few floors up was to risk her dying in an elevator. The decision was made in a fraction of a second. "We're opening her chest here," Aris had declared in the trauma bay, her voice leaving no room for debate. Harrison, the administrator, had looked like he was about to faint, but Sarah Jenkins had simply nodded and begun orchestrating the impossible, turning a corner of the ER into a makeshift surgical theater. Ben, his hands now steady, painted the girl's chest with antiseptic solution. Aris took the scalpel. She made a single swift incision down the center of the sternum. It was a brutal, primal act of medicine, a last resort. There was a sickening crack as she used a sternal saw to open the ribcage, exposing the thoracic cavity. The sight was horrific. The pericardial sac, normally a thin, translucent sheath, was a swollen, bruised, deep purple bladder stretched taut with the blood that had been strangling the heart within. It was not beating. It was quivering uselessly. "Metzenbaum scissors," Aris commanded. The nurse slapped them into her hand. She incised the pericardium. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A gush of dark venous blood erupted, spilling into the suction tube with a wet, roaring sound. It was the release of a dam, the uncorking of a fatal pressure. And as the sac deflated, the heart, suddenly liberated, gave a violent, convulsive shudder. On the monitor, the flat line wavered. Then a single, lonely spike appeared. A beat. It was followed by another, slow and tentative, then another stronger. The rhythmic beep, the most beautiful sound in the world, returned to the room, weak but steady. A collective, unconscious sigh of relief went through the room. Eris had literally snatched the girl from the jaws of death right there amidst the chaos of the ER. She had won her gambit. Now she had to secure the victory. "She's stable enough to move. Let's go," Eris ordered. "Ben, you're with me." Now in the pristine, controlled environment of OR3, the true work began. The frantic, life-saving butchery of the ER was replaced by the meticulous artistry of restorative surgery. The girl was on full cardiopulmonary bypass, her life's functions outsourced to a humming, gurgling machine run by the perfusionist Eris trusted above all others. Her heart was still a quiet, motionless canvas upon which Eris would work. With the chest open, Eris quickly identified the source of the bleeding, a tear in the right atrial appendage, a small ear-shaped pouch on the heart's upper chamber. It was a tricky, delicate injury, one that a general surgeon might have struggled to even locate. 40 Proline Suture. Eris set her voice, a low murmur that was part of the room's symphony of beeps and hums. Ben stood opposite her, his hands moving in sync with hers, retracting tissue, keeping the surgical field clear. The fear and hesitation that had plagued him in the ER were gone, burned away in the crucible of the code blue, and replaced by a state of heightened, almost transcendent focus. He was witnessing a masterclass, and he was a part of it. He watched Eris's hands as she began to stitch the tear. Her movements were impossibly precise. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She was not just a surgeon repairing tissue. She was a weaver mending a priceless tapestry, her needle dipping and rising with an innate, perfect rhythm. She worked with a quiet reverence for the organ in her hands, her touch both firm and gentle. "You see this, Ben?" She said, her voice calm and instructive, as if they were in a routine teaching session and not a life-or-death crisis. "The tissue here is friable, easily torn. You can't just pull the stitches tight. You have to coax them. You're persuading the tissue to come together, not forcing it." Ben absorbed every word, every movement. He was seeing the vast difference between the rote memorization of surgical steps and the intuitive, adaptive genius of a true master. Croft had taught him the rules of surgery. Eris was teaching him the art. He had been afraid of Croft's power to end his career, but he now realized that a career spent under Croft's tutelage would be a pale imitation of the medicine he was witnessing now. His loyalty was no longer divided. It was cemented. He belonged here, with her. For the next hour, Eris worked in a state of pure flow. She repaired the atrial appendage, reinforced the suture line, and then conducted a painstaking survey of the rest of the heart and the great vessels, searching for any other contusions or tears. It was this meticulous, unhurried thoroughness in the midst of a crisis that set her apart. Croft treated the patient. Eris treated the problem in its entirety. Back in the ER, Julian Croft was drowning. He had not followed Eris. To do so would have been the ultimate act of surrender, a public declaration of his own inadequacy. Instead, consumed by a volcanic, impotent rage, he had turned back to the chaos of the ER, determined to reassert his control, to prove that he was still the commander. But the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The ER was no longer his kingdom. When he barked an order, the nurses would hesitate for a fraction of a second, their eyes flicking towards Sarah Jenkins for confirmation. The quiet, efficient network that Sarah had activated now worked against him. His authority, which had seemed so absolute an hour ago, was now a hollow shell. The staff still obeyed him, but the eager, unquestioning compliance was gone. It had been replaced by a wary, judgmental obedience. They were watching him, and he knew it. Humiliated and furious, he decided he needed a victory. He needed to save a life decisively and brilliantly to remind everyone who he was. He strode over to hallway C, where the elderly man Eris had identified was now being attended to by Dr. Ramirez. "I'll take this one," Croft announced, dismissing Ramirez with a wave of his hand. He pulled the man's chart. Abdominal pain, hypotension. The note from Ramirez, prompted by Sarah, suggested a possible aortic aneurysm. A classic textbook case. This would be his redemption. "Get him to Trauma 1, Croft commanded. "And get me a vascular surgery tray. Let's move." But his confidence was a performance. Inside his mind was a chaotic storm of anger and self-doubt. Thorne's words echoed in his ears, her cold, clinical takedown of his leadership. The image of her standing with that scalpel seizing control was burned into his thoughts. He found himself second-guessing his own decisions. In Trauma 1, he performed a quick bedside ultrasound, his hands feeling clumsy and slow. He saw the massive abdominal aortic aneurysm, just as Ramirez had suspected. It was leaking a slow bleed that was rapidly turning into a catastrophic hemorrhage. He needed to get the man to an operating room immediately. "Call the OR," he yelled at a nurse. "Tell them I'm coming up with a ruptured AAA. Have them page the on-call vascular surgeon." "Which OR doctor?" the nurse asked. "Any of them. Just get me a room." Dr. Thorne has requisitioned OR 3 and OR 4 and 5 are currently in use for other bridge collapse victims, the nurse reported, her tone flat and informational. OR 2 is being prepped, but it will be 15 minutes. 15 minutes. A lifetime. Croft's face tightened. Thorne, even from afar, was still controlling the board, still boxing him in. "Then we'll have to stabilize him here," Croft decided, his voice tight. "Get me 2 more units of blood wide open, and start him on a pressor drip to keep his pressure up." A junior resident, emboldened by the new atmosphere in the ER, dared to question him. "Doctor, won't pressors increase the shear stress on the aneurysm? It could make the rupture worse." Croft shot him a venomous look. "Are you questioning my order?" "No, sir," the resident mumbled, backing down. But the seed of doubt was planted. Croft hesitated for a second, his mind racing. Was the resident right? He was. It was a classic pharmacological dilemma. But he needed to get the patient's blood pressure up. He was trapped between 2 bad options, and his mind clouded by rage and humiliation. Couldn't find the clear path it normally would. "Just do it," he snapped, overriding his own better judgment. He turned back to the patient, his focus shattered. He was no longer the calm, decisive general. He was a rattled commander, making rash decisions, his authority fraying with every passing second. And as the nurse pushed the first dose of vasopressors into the patient's IV line, the monitor above the patient's head, which had been holding a fragile stability, began to alarm violently. The patient's blood pressure, instead of rising, plummeted. His heart rate soared into a chaotic, unreadable rhythm. Croft had made the wrong call. The increase in pressure had caused the leaking aneurysm to rupture completely. The man was now bleeding out into his own body at a torrential rate. Croft stared at the monitor, his blood turning to ice. The confident, booming commander was gone, replaced by a man watching his own hubris kill a patient right in front of his eyes. While Julian Croft fought a losing battle against his own pride, a new reality was taking shape in the corridors of Sterling Memorial. News in a hospital travels through an informal, incredibly efficient network of nurses, orderlies, and residents, a grapevine that rustles with every hushed conversation and knowing glance. And the story of what had happened in the ER was spreading like wildfire, evolving from whispered rumor to established legend in the space of a single hour. They were talking about it in the cafeteria lines, in the locker rooms, at the nursing stations, on every floor. They spoke of how Dr. Croft, in his arrogance, had cast out the one person who could save a dying girl. They described in awed tones how Dr. Thorne hadn't argued, but had built a quiet rebellion, rallying the ER's formidable nursing staff to her side. And they recounted the climax, the code blue, the standoff, and the ice-cold ultimatum delivered over a dying patient, with the reverence usually reserved for a blockbuster film. Eris Thorne had become, in the span of an afternoon, a folk hero. She was the quiet surgeon who had roared the outsider, who had seized the throne not by birthright, but by undeniable, breathtaking skill. Inside OR 3, Eris was oblivious to her burgeoning legend. She was in the final, delicate stages of the procedure. The girl's heart was now beating on its own, a strong, steady rhythm that was a testament to the perfection of the repair. The bypass machine had been disconnected, and the girl's own lungs were breathing for her. Eris was placing the last of the sternal wires, preparing to close the chest she had so violently opened an hour before. Her team worked around her with a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just a surgical team. They were part of a story, a moment that would be recounted for years. Their pride in their leader was a palpable energy in the room. "Vitals are rock solid," Dr. Evans, the anesthesiologist, announced from behind his monitors, a deep satisfaction in his voice. "She's as stable as a table. It's a miracle, Eris." "It's physiology," Mark Eris replied, her focus still on her task. But a small, rare smile touched her eyes, and a well-drilled team. Ben, placing a final suture, felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed him. He had participated in a miracle. He had seen the very definition of grace under pressure and had played his part. The fear he had felt of Croft seemed like a distant memory from another lifetime. He knew with absolute certainty that he had chosen the right side. His career path was no longer a question mark. It was a straight, clear line leading directly to the kind of doctor Eris Thorne was. Just as Eris was about to place the final wire, the intercom in the OR crackled to life, a harsh, intrusive sound in the calm sanctuary. It was Sarah Jenkins's voice, but stripped of its usual composure, tight with an urgency that made everyone in the room freeze. "Dr. Thorne, we have a critical situation in Trauma 1. Dr. Croft is losing the ruptured AAA. The patient is exsanguinating. We need you." It wasn't a request. It was a summons, an admission of total catastrophic failure. Croft was living a nightmare. The alarms in Trauma 1 were a deafening, relentless scream, a soundtrack to his professional demise. The patient's blood pressure was barely registering. They had pushed 6 units of blood into him, but it was like pouring water into a sieve. The ruptured aneurysm was a fire hose of blood emptying into his abdominal cavity. "Get me more blood," Croft roared, his voice hoarse. "We're out of O negative," a nurse shouted back. "The blood bank is trying to keep up with the demand from all the other victims." Croft stared at the patient's abdomen, which was now visibly distended and rigid, a cavity full of blood. He knew what he had to do. He needed to get his hands on the aorta to clamp it to stop the bleeding. But that was a massive, complex procedure, one that required an OR and a vascular surgeon. He was a general trauma surgeon skilled in a wide range of procedures, but this was the domain of a specialist. And he was trapped in an ER bay with no resources and no time. His commands became more frantic, less coherent. "Pack the abdomen. Get me lap pads. More of them. We need to apply pressure." The staff around him moved with a desperate haste, but their movements were tinged with a sense of futility. They were no longer following a commander. They were humoring a mad king participating in a hopeless charade. They could see he was lost. His confidence shattered, his decisions reactive and panicked. They exchanged furtive, worried glances. They knew as he did that the man on the table was going to die, and that his death would be a direct result of the doctor's catastrophic failure of judgment. Sarah Jenkins saw it all. She saw the fear in Croft's eyes the moment he realized he was utterly, completely out of his depth. She didn't hesitate. Her loyalty was not to the hospital hierarchy, it was to the patient on the table. She turned on her heel, left the unfolding disaster, and marched directly to the administrator's office. She found Harrison pacing behind his desk, his face the color of ash, a phone pressed to his ear, as he listened to a litany of bad news from the hospital's legal counsel. Sarah didn't wait to be acknowledged. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice cutting through his phone call. "Dr. Croft's patient is dying. He has lost control of the situation. Our only chance of saving that man and preventing another massive lawsuit is Dr. Thorne." Harrison looked up, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of horror. "Another one," he whispered. He slammed the phone down. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah ordered her to abandon her own patient. "Her patient is stable," Sarah stated flatly. "I just heard from the OR. The surgery was a complete success. She is the only one in this hospital who has the skill and the authority to fix this. You need to order Croft to consult her. Now." The word hung in the air. Consult. In the rigid, ego-driven world of surgery, ordering a senior surgeon to consult with a rival on his own crashing patient was the ultimate humiliation. It was a public stripping of rank, a formal declaration of incompetence. Harrison stared at her, his mind reeling. The legal and financial implications were staggering. One death could be explained as a tragic outcome in a mass casualty event. 2 deaths, both overseen by the same surgeon who had been publicly challenged by another, was not a tragedy. It was a clear-cut case of negligence and malpractice that would cost the hospital millions and destroy its reputation. His decision was not driven by medicine, but by fear. He grabbed the phone on his desk that patched directly into the hospital's intercom system. He took a shaky breath. Dr. Croft, his voice amplified and tinny, echoed through the ER and into the stunned silence of Trauma 1. "You are to request an immediate cardiothoracic and vascular consult from Dr. Thorne. Acknowledge." The world in Trauma 1 stopped. Every nurse, every resident froze and stared at Croft. His face, which had been flushed with panic, drained of all color. He stood there, a bloody lap pad in his hand, as the administrator's words echoed around him, a public sentence of execution for his career. He was being ordered to go hat in hand and beg for help from the woman he had tried to destroy. For a long moment he said nothing. the silence broken only by the flatline alarm of the monitor. Then, in a choked, barely audible whisper, he spoke into the chaos. Acknowledged. The walk from Trauma 1 to Operating Room 3 was the longest of Julian Croft's life. Every step was a fresh agony. The hallways, which had been a backdrop to his confident command just an hour before, were now a gauntlet of judgment. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him. They weren't staring with open contempt. It was worse. They averted their gazes as he approached a gesture of pity and embarrassment that was more damning than any accusation. The squeak of his pristine leather shoes on the linoleum floor sounded like a scream in his ears. He arrived at the doors to OR3, his hand hovering over the push plate, his heart pounding with a nauseating mix of dread and shame. He had to go in there and admit his failure. He had to ask for her help. A part of him prayed that he would find something wrong, some complication, some flaw in her work that he could use to salvage a shred of his pride. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene that met him was his worst nightmare. There was no chaos. There was no flaw. He was met with a wall of serene, focused competence. The girl was on the table, her chest neatly closed, her vital signs displayed on the monitor in a series of strong, perfect green lines. The rhythmic, steady beep of her healthy heart was a mockery of the death scream of the alarms in his own bay. Aris was standing at the head of the table, placing the final dressing on the incision, her work complete. Her team was moving around her with a quiet, efficient grace. She looked up as he entered, her expression not of triumph, but of weary professionalism. She had already heard the summons from Sarah. Croft stood there, frozen in the doorway, stripped of his anger, his arrogance, and his authority. He saw the surgical technique he had dismissed as theatrical had produced a living, breathing miracle. He saw the team he had tried to scatter, working in perfect unison. He saw the resident he had belittled performing with a confidence that now eclipsed his own. He saw in one devastating, soul-crushing instant the vast, unbridgeable chasm between his own competence and her genius. He was a pretender, and he had just walked into the court of the true queen. Julian Croft stood in the doorway of Operating Room 3, a ghost at a feast. The steady, rhythmic beep of the girl's heart monitor was both a miracle and a personal indictment. Every stable beat was a testament to his failure. He was trapped in the amber of his own humiliation, unable to move, unable to speak. Aris finished securing the dressing on the girl's chest, her movements economical and final. She stripped off her gloves and looked at him, her gaze not triumphant but analytical. She was a physician, assessing a new complex symptom. His presence in her OR was a problem to be managed, a complication in an already catastrophic day. "Report," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the tone she used to demand information from a resident, not a senior colleague. The single word was a bucket of ice water, shocking him out of his paralysis. He swallowed the sound, unnaturally loud in the quiet room. His own voice, when it finally came out, was a ragged, unfamiliar thing. Ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. He began the clinical terms, feeling like ash in his mouth. In Trauma 1, he's exsanguinating. I can't get supraceliac control of the aorta. The bleeding is too massive. We've pushed 8 units. He's arrested twice. We got him back, but he's gone. The last word was a whisper of defeat. He had already pronounced his own patient dead. Aris listened, her expression unchanging. She processed the information, her mind assembling the data points, discarding the emotional noise of his confession. She saw the tactical situation with brutal clarity. The patient was too unstable to move to a dedicated vascular suite. Croft had lost control. The team in the ER was demoralized and ineffective under his command. Her decision, like all the others she had made that day, was swift, logical, and absolute. She turned to her anesthesiologist. "Mark, how soon can you get her extubated and stable for transfer to the CVIQ?" Dr. Evans glanced at his monitors. "She's breathing on her own. Strong. I can have her ready to move in 15 minutes. Maybe 10. "Good," Aris said. Then she looked at the circulating nurse. "Notify the ICU. I want my patient moved the second she is stable. Then I want this entire room turned over. Get everything from the heart-lung bypass out of here. I need a full major vascular tray, a cell saver, and 10 units of O-neg blood on standby. We're turning this OR into a vascular suite. You have 10 minutes. The order was audacious. She was kicking her own triumph out of the nest to make room for another's failure. The team, which had been basking in the glow of their success, snapped to a new level of focus. They didn't question. They moved. This was their new reality. They were Eris Thorne's rapid response team, and she was the only authority that mattered. As the room began to transform around them, a whirlwind of blue-gowned figures clearing equipment and bringing in new sterile trays, Eris finally turned her full attention to Croft. He was still standing in the doorway, a statue of impotence watching his last vestiges of authority being dismantled and repurposed by her will. "You were the last one to examine him," she stated. "It wasn't a question. You've seen the ultrasound. You know the anatomy of his specific injury better than anyone else in this hospital right now." Croft could only nod a numb, jerky motion. "I need a second pair of experienced hands," she continued, her voice clinical. "The bleed is massive. Getting control will be difficult. I can't do it alone." A flicker of something hope relief sparked in Croft's eyes. She was offering him a lifeline, a chance to be part of the solution, to redeem himself. But then came the rest of the order, and the spark died, extinguished by a final crushing wave of humiliation. "You will assist me," Eris said, "but let's be perfectly clear about the terms. You are not the primary surgeon. You are not my co-surgeon. You will be my assistant. You will follow my instructions instantly and without question. There will be no deviations, no suggestions, and no arguments. Your job is to provide suction to retract and to do exactly what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. Am I understood?" She had just demoted him in front of her entire team to a role typically reserved for a third-year resident. She had stripped him of his autonomy, his judgment, his very identity as a surgeon. He was to be nothing more than an extension of her will, a pair of hands for her to command. The silence stretched. Everyone in the room watched him, waiting for the explosion, for the final defiant roar of the fallen king. But there was nothing left to fight with. He had no authority, no credibility, no options. To refuse would be to abandon the patient completely, the final unforgivable sin. To accept was to swallow the ashes of his pride and acknowledge her as his absolute superior. He looked at her face, searching for a hint of malice, of triumphalism. He found none. There was only a cold, hard, professional resolve. This wasn't about punishing him. This was about saving the patient. The realization was perhaps the most humbling blow of all. To her, he wasn't even significant enough to be an object of revenge. He was simply a resource to be utilized in the most efficient way possible. His shoulders, which had been squared with defiance just an hour ago, finally slumped. The fight went out of him, leaving behind a hollow, weary shell. "I understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good," Eris replied, turning away as if the matter was settled. "Now scrub in." 15 minutes later, Croft's patient was wheeled into the transformed OR3. The scene that awaited them when Eris made the first incision was a vision of surgical hell. The moment the blade breached the peritoneum, a torrent of dark, non-clotting blood welled up, overflowing the surgical field and spilling onto the floor. The cell-saver suction roared to life, but it was like using a teacup to bail out the ocean. "He's lost another 2 liters on the table," Evans called out from behind the ether screen. "Pressure is non-existent. I need to get proximal control." Eris said, her voice tight with focus. She pushed her hands deep into the bloody chaos of the abdomen, trying to feel her way through the slick, displaced organs to the spine where the aorta lay. "I can't see anything." "Suction, doctor." Croft, standing opposite her, moved the suction tip, his hands feeling clumsy, his mind numb. This was his mess, his failure. The sheer scale of the hemorrhage was overwhelming. He would have given up. He would have declared the patient dead. But Eris did not give up. She was relentless. "More light. I need a deep retractor, Ben. Gently. I need to expose the supraceliac aorta." For the next 20 minutes, they fought a desperate, bloody battle. Eris was a force of nature, her hands moving with a certainty that seemed impossible in the blind, bloody field. She directed Ben and Croft with sharp single-word commands. Retract, suction. More pressure here. Slowly, miraculously, she began to impose order on the chaos. She managed to dissect her way through the retroperitoneum and encircle the aorta high in the chest, just below the diaphragm. She clamped it. The torrential bleeding slowed to a manageable ooze. "We have control," she announced, a collective sigh of relief moving through the room. "He's stabilized. Let's get some blood back into him and see what we're dealing with." As the anesthesiologist worked to resuscitate the patient, Eris and her team began the painstaking work of evacuating the massive hematoma and identifying the source of the rupture. The aneurysm was enormous, a diseased, paper-thin sac that had essentially exploded. Now came the most critical part, grafting a new aorta into place. This required a level of vascular skill that was at the absolute peak of the surgical profession. Eris began to work her movements once again, becoming a ballet of precision. She prepared to suture the top end of the graft. It was a difficult angle deep within the abdomen. She needed the tissue presented to her in a very specific way. "Dr. Croft," she said, her eyes fixed on the target through her surgical loops. "I need you to rotate the clamp 30 degrees clockwise and apply gentle upward traction. It will expose the aortic neck for me." Croft moved to obey, but his own training, his own instincts screamed at him. The maneuver she was asking for felt wrong. It was counterintuitive. Standard procedure dictated rotating the other way to avoid putting tension on the fragile renal arteries. His old arrogance, buried but not yet dead, flickered to life. He knew better. He hesitated. His hands froze over the clamp. "That might compromise the renals," he said, his voice tight. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Eris did not look up. Her entire being was focused on the delicate tissue in front of her. "I am aware of the location of the renal arteries, doctor. I need that angle to place the stitch. Rotate the clamp." This was it. The final moment of rebellion. The last chance to assert his own knowledge, his own training. He could follow his instinct, the safe by-the-book move, and refuse. Or he could trust her, this woman whose methods he had scorned, and perform a maneuver he believed to be wrong. He looked across the table at her face visible between her mask and her loops. He saw no doubt, no hesitation, only an absolute, unshakable certainty that radiated from her like heat. He looked at the dying man on the table, a man who was only still alive because of her will. He thought of the girl in the ICU with a perfectly repaired heart. His way had led to disaster. Her way had led to miracles. The battle within him, which had raged all day, was finally over. There was no victory, only a quiet, profound surrender. He lowered his head, a gesture so subtle that only Ben noticed it, a physical act of submission. He took a breath. "Yes, doctor," he said, his voice clear and steady for the first time in hours. He rotated the clamp exactly as she had instructed. "Tell me what you need me to do." The moment Julian Croft uttered the words, "Tell me what you need me to do," the charged, toxic atmosphere in the operating room did not just dissipate, it inverted. The crushing weight of ego, pride, and resentment vanished, and in its place a new, purer element rushed in to fill the void, an absolute shared focus on the single life hanging in the balance. Croft's surrender had not just been a personal capitulation. It had been a cleansing fire, burning away everything that was not essential, leaving only the stark, clean lines of the problem before them. He rotated the clamp. As the aortic neck came into view at the precise, unconventional angle Eris had demanded, he finally saw it. The maneuver, which his training had told him was risky, had masterfully used the surrounding tissues as a natural retractor, giving her a perfect, unobstructed view of the fragile, diseased aorta without putting any direct pressure on the renal arteries. It was not reckless. It was brilliant. It was a move born not from a textbook, but from a profound, intuitive understanding of three-dimensional anatomy, an understanding that Croft, for all his pedigree, realized he did not possess. He watched his mind no longer a battlefield of resentment, but a lecture hall where he was the sole humbled student. He saw how Eris loaded her needle driver, the way she angled her wrist to take the first stitch. Every movement was a lesson. He had always seen her work as flashy, needlessly complex. Now, with the veil of his own arrogance lifted, he saw the truth. It wasn't complexity for its own sake. It was a sublime efficiency, a surgical language of such elegance that it made his own by-the-book methods seem crude and clumsy, like trying to write poetry with a hammer. "Follow the suture line with the suction," Eris instructed, her voice low and even. "Keep the field dry for me." "Yes," Dr. Croft replied, his own voice steady. He was no longer her rival. He was her instrument, and he performed his function with a new focused precision. He anticipated her movements, cleared the blood just before her needle entered the tissue, and held the retractors with an unwavering stillness. He was a good surgeon, a technically excellent surgeon, and for the first time he was putting that skill in the service of another's genius. For the next hour they worked in a state of almost silent unison. The only sounds were the steady beep of the recovering heart monitor, the hiss of the ventilator, and Eris's quiet, concise commands. They were a study in contrast. her small, steady hands weaving the Dacron graft into place, creating a new, perfect vessel where there had been only catastrophic failure. His larger, stronger hands providing the support, the exposure, the clear field she needed to perform her magic. Ben watched them from his position across the table, utterly captivated. He was witnessing something more profound than a life being saved. He was witnessing a transformation. He was seeing the complete deconstruction and rebuilding of a man, all taking place over an open abdomen. They completed the proximal anastomosis, the connection of the graft to the aorta above the rupture, and the most dangerous part of the surgery was over. Eris released the supraceliac clamp, allowing blood to flow down the new graft. Blood flow restored to the lower extremities, Dr. Evans announced. Pressure is holding at 100/70. He's stable. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost dizzying washed through the room. They had done it. They had pulled him back from the very brink. All that remained was the distal anastomosis and the closure. It was routine from here, or it should have been. Just as Eris began to prepare the lower end of the aorta for the final connection, a new, terrifying variable entered the equation. A small, almost imperceptible welling of fresh, bright red blood appeared high up in the surgical field near the pancreas. It wasn't the dark venous ooze they had been fighting. This was arterial. "What was that?" Eris said, her head snapping up. "Pressure is dropping again," Evans warned, his voice sharp with alarm. 100/70, now 90/60. "Damn it," Eris breathed. "Suction." Croft immediately moved the suction tip to the spot, but as soon as he cleared the blood, the area refilled. It was a rogue bleeder, a small artery that must have been torn during the frantic initial dissection to get control of the aorta. In a stable patient, it would be a minor annoyance. In a patient with no clotting factors left after a massive hemorrhage, it was a death sentence. The location was a surgeon's nightmare. It was tucked behind the superior mesenteric artery, the main blood supply to the intestines. Eris was holding the graft and the distal aorta in place with her left hand. To let go would be to lose control of the main repair. She couldn't reach the bleeder with her right hand without completely obscuring her own view. They were checkmated. 80/50, Evans called out. The steady beep of the monitor was accelerating into a panicked rhythm. Eris's mind raced, cycling through a dozen impossible options. She couldn't clamp it without sacrificing the intestines. She couldn't reach it to suture it. For the first time that day, a flicker of doubt appeared in her eyes. She looked across the table at Croft. His face was pale, his eyes wide as he stared at the new, uncontrolled bleeding. He understood the geometry of the problem instantly. He knew they were trapped. In that moment, he was no longer a subordinate. He was the only other person on Earth who could understand the impossible calculus she was facing. All the history between them, the insults, the humiliation, the rivalry evaporated. They were just two surgeons facing down death and losing. Eris made a decision. It was a gamble born of pure, desperate necessity. She had to trust him. Not just his hands, but his mind. "Julian," she said. The use of his first name was a shock, a sudden intimate sound in the sterile room. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement of him not as an assistant, but as a peer. His eyes met hers. "I cannot reach the bleeder," she said, her voice a low, urgent current. "I cannot let go of this graft. You have to control it." He stared at her, understanding the weight of what she was asking. She was entrusting the most delicate part of the repair to him. "I'm going to talk you through it," she continued, her voice impossibly calm. "I need you to take a 5-0 proline stitch on a cardiovascular needle. You will place a single figure-of-8 suture just at the base of the vessel. You cannot go too deep or you will hit the pancreas. You cannot go too wide or you will compromise the SMA. Your window is 2 millimeters. I will keep the field as clear as I can." She was giving him the needle, but she was also giving him a chance. A chance for redemption, not in the eyes of the hospital, but in the only place it now mattered, right here, in this room, over this patient. For a heartbeat, the old Croft, the one who had second-guessed her before, might have argued, might have suggested another approach. But that man was gone. He looked at her eyes, saw the absolute trust she was placing in him, and felt a profound, humbling sense of responsibility settle over him. "Give me the needle," he said, his voice a rock. A nurse slapped a loaded needle driver into his hand. Eris shifted her body slightly, giving him the best possible angle. "The field is yours, Julian," she said. He leaned over the patient, his world shrinking to that tiny bleeding point deep inside the abdomen. Eris's voice was a calm, steady presence in his ear, guiding him. "Steady now. Identify the vessel. That's it. Start your bite from left to right. Shallow. Control the needle tip with your wrist, not your elbow. His hands, which had felt so clumsy before, were now extensions of his will. He was a surgeon again. He slid the needle into the tissue, the movement precise, controlled. He felt the familiar give of the vessel wall, the subtle feedback that told him he was in the right place. Good, Eris breathed. Now backhand, complete the figure of 8. Don't pull too tight, just enough to coapt the tissue. He threw the second loop, his movements fluid and economical. He placed a single surgical knot and cinched it down. The bleeding stopped instantly. He held his breath, watching the spot for a full 10 seconds. It remained dry. 70/50, 80/50. Evans called out from behind the curtain, his voice rising with cautious optimism. Pressure is coming back up. 100/60. Stable. Julian Croft pulled his hands back, the needle driver still clutched in his fingers. He had done it. They had done it. He slowly raised his head and looked at Eris. The tension in the room finally truly broke. It was replaced by a shared, silent, profound exhaustion. Ben let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The circulating nurse leaned back against a wall, her shoulders slumping. They finished the final anastomosis and closed the abdomen in a comfortable, practiced silence. The patient, against all odds, was alive. His life was a testament not to a single surgeon's genius, but to the unison of two who had, in the crucible of crisis, found a way to work together. As the team began to wheel the patient out to the ICU, Eris and Croft were left alone in the room, stripping off their gowns. The silence was thick with unspoken words. Croft looked at his hands, then at Eris. His expression was stripped bare of all its former arrogance and pride. It was open, raw, and filled with a deep, grudging respect that was slowly turning into something more. He wasn't going to apologize. An apology was too small, too inadequate for the enormity of what had happened. Instead, he sought to understand. That rotation, he said, his voice quiet. On the aortic clamp. In all my training, all the papers I've read, I've never seen that before. It was not a challenge. It was a question from a student to a master. It was his admission of her superiority. It was the first step onto a new, unknown ground. Eris paused, her back to him. She considered her answer for a moment. My father was a watchmaker, she said, simply turning to face him. He taught me that the smallest parts are the most important, and that sometimes you have to move one gear the wrong way to make the whole machine work. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then walked out of the operating room, leaving him alone with the quiet, steady hum of the machines, and the dawning realization that he had just been operated on as well. Dawn broke over the city, washing the sky in pale shades of rose and gray. The new light streamed through the large windows of the hospital, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows down the now quiet corridors. The storm had passed. The frantic, screaming chaos of the night had receded, leaving behind a deep collective exhaustion and the quiet, humming work of recovery. In the cardiothoracic intensive care unit, the only sounds were the gentle hiss of ventilators and the steady, rhythmic beeping of monitors. Eris Thorne stood between two beds. In one, the young girl from the bridge collapse slept peacefully, her breathing, even her heart beating with the strong, steady rhythm Eris had restored. In the other, the elderly man whose life had nearly drained away into his own body lay resting, his blood pressure stable, his life held secure by the new vessel Eris and Julian had woven into place. Two lives pulled back from the absolute brink were now quietly mending. Eris placed a hand on the girl's chart, reading the nurse's notes. Everything was perfect. She felt a profound weariness settle deep into her bones, but beneath it was the quiet, solid satisfaction of a craftsman who had seen her work hold against the tide. She had not just saved them. She had validated every choice, every risk, every moment of her arduous, lonely career. The soft squeak of shoes on linoleum made her turn. Julian Croft stood in the doorway, looking hesitant and out of place. He was no longer wearing his blood-stained scrubs, but a fresh set. The imperious, arrogant mask he had worn for years was gone, leaving his face looking younger, more vulnerable. The circles under his eyes were as dark as her own. He didn't enter the room, but stood respectfully at the threshold. The silence between them was long, but no longer heavy with animosity. It was the quiet of two soldiers surveying a battlefield after the fight was over. I just came from the surgical ICU, he said, his voice low. Your other patients, The woman with the epidural hematoma. The others you flagged, they're all stable. You were right about all of them. It was a confession, a concession, a final laying down of arms. I'm glad to hear it, Harris said simply. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes on the patient charts on the steady green lines of the monitors. He was a man adrift, searching for a new map. I've spent the last 3 hours in the hospital library. He said, the admission costing him a visible effort. I was reviewing your published papers on aortic grafting and emergency thoracotomy, the ones I dismissed. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all its former condescension. It was the look of a man who had been forced to re-examine the very foundations of his knowledge. The way you used the plegated sutures to reinforce the atrial repair, he said, his voice filled with a genuine intellectual curiosity that transcended their personal history. And the rotation on the aortic clamp. You created a tension line that protected the branch vessels. It's not in any textbook, Eris. It's revolutionary. I was wrong. What you do is not reckless. It's a level of surgical thinking I have never encountered before. It was the most profound apology he could have possibly offered. He had not apologized for his behavior, for his insults, or for his arrogance. He had apologized for his ignorance. For a surgeon of his pride, it was the ultimate admission of defeat and the ultimate gesture of respect. Eris considered him for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion, the humiliation, but also a glimmer of something new in his eyes, a sincere, desperate desire to understand. The animosity she had felt toward him had burned itself out, leaving behind only the weary empathy of a fellow physician. It's about understanding the forces at play, she said, her voice softer than before. The tissue tells you what it needs if you're willing to listen instead of just imposing the textbook upon it. He nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. I would like to understand it better, he said. It was a humble request for tutelage, a seismic shift in their dynamic. Before Eris could reply, another figure appeared in the doorway. It was Mr. Harrison, the administrator, looking remarkably more composed than he had hours earlier. He was flanked by 2 other figures in suits, members of the hospital's executive board who had clearly been roused from their beds for an emergency meeting. Dr. Thorne Harrison began, his voice filled with a new profound reverence. May we have a word? Eris and Croft stepped out into the hallway. Harrison's gratitude was effusive, almost embarrassingly so. He spoke of the lives she had saved, of the disaster she had single-handedly averted. The board members nodded along, their expressions a mixture of awe and immense financial relief. The board has been in an emergency session for the past 4 hours. Reviewing the events of last night, Harrison continued, getting to the point. We have reviewed the preliminary statements from the ER staff, from Dr. Croft, and from Nurse Jenkins. It is clear that the hospital's crisis response protocols were inadequate. This was a monumental understatement. And it is equally clear that your leadership, your innovation, and your decisive action prevented a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. He paused, taking a deep breath. Therefore, the board has voted unanimously. We are creating a new position effective immediately. We would like to offer you the role of Chief of Surgical Innovation and Crisis Response for Sterling Memorial. He let the title hang in the air. It was a grand, sweeping title, but both Eris and Croft understood its true meaning. It was a formal coronation. They were handing her the keys to the kingdom. The role would give her hospital-wide authority to write new protocols, to lead all trauma responses, and to implement the kind of systemic changes she saw fit. She would answer directly to the board, bypassing the traditional departmental hierarchy, bypassing men like Albright and Croft. Croft's reaction was telling. A day ago, such an announcement would have sent him into a jealous rage. Now he simply stood by his expression, neutral. He looked at Eris and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an endorsement. He knew better than anyone that she had earned it. Eris looked at the expectant faces of the administrators. She thought of the chaotic ER of the patients who had almost died due to a rigid, arrogant system. She thought of the good, talented residents like Ben who were being stifled by a culture that valued seniority over skill. She saw an opportunity not for power but for change. I accept, she said, her voice firm, but on a few conditions. This new role will not be a figurehead position. We will be rebuilding our entire approach to emergency medicine from the ground up. My protocols will be implemented, and training will be mandatory for all staff from interns to department heads. She glanced briefly at Croft. "We will foster a culture of collaboration where the best idea wins regardless of who it comes from. Competence, not title, will be the ultimate authority in a crisis. If the board is prepared to fully support that vision, then I will accept." Harrison and the board members almost fell over themselves in their haste to agree. "Whatever you need, Doctor. The hospital is yours to command." The sun was higher in the sky, now flooding the hallways with the clean, hopeful light of a new day. Eris walked through the hospital, no longer an outsider, but its newly minted leader. The atmosphere was palpably different. As she passed, residents and nurses would pause, their expressions a mixture of reverence and awe. They were the whispers that had become a legend. She saw Ben looking exhausted, but exhilarated, teaching a younger intern the proper way to insert a chest tube. He saw her and smiled, a look of profound gratitude and loyalty. He was the future, and she knew he was in good hands. Further down the hall, she saw Julian Croft briefing a team of surgeons on a new case. He saw her approaching. Their eyes met across the crowded corridor. There was no animosity, no tension. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod of professional respect. Eris returned it. It was not the beginning of a friendship, but it was the foundation of a new, more potent alliance, one forged in the crucible of crisis. She continued on her way, the quiet hum of the hospital, a familiar, comforting sound. The system had not been torn down. It had been shocked into evolving. She knew the path ahead would be filled with political battles, with resistance to change, with the inertia of old habits. But for the first time, she felt she was not alone in the fight. True authority, she reflected, was not a title bestowed upon you, but a space you carved out through sheer, undeniable competence. And a good system wasn't one that was perfect, but one that was capable of learning, of adapting, of making room for a better way, when it was so brilliantly, so undeniably proven to exist. The dawn was not just breaking over the city. It was breaking over Sterling Memorial, and it felt like a new beginning. In the months that followed, the Thorn Protocol became the new gold standard for crisis response at Sterling Memorial. The changes were palpable. Mortality rates in the ER dropped, efficiency soared, and a new spirit of collaborative, merit-based medicine began to take root. Dr. Croft, humbled and transformed, became one of Eris's most effective lieutenants in implementing the new training, his advocacy for her methods made all the more powerful by his own public failure. Ben, under her mentorship, blossomed into a gifted and compassionate surgeon. The true measure of her victory was not in the title she had gained, but in the countless lives that would be saved in the future by a better, stronger, more resilient system. The change had come not from a single dramatic moment of confrontation, but from the quiet, relentless courage to act when it mattered most, proving that the heart of any great institution is not its rules, but the integrity of the people willing to challenge them. Thank you for joining us for this story. Here we believe in the power of character, the weight of integrity, and the moments that reveal who we truly are. These events, inspired by the strength people show under the greatest of pressures, are more than just entertainment. They are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. If this story resonated with you, and you appreciate tales of quiet courage and earned respect, we would be honored if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help us continue to bring these meaningful narratives to a community that values them. We are grateful for your time and your attention. Thank you.